My name is Philip Polk Palmer. Um, I got a couple of disclaimers. One of them is I won't be doing any PowerPoint. I've got pictures like everybody does, and if y'all want to see some of my phone later, that's great. But there are people that have much better pictures than I do and have done them. But the main thing is I'm pretty much a Luddite. And if I start using this, I'm going to click something wrong. The screen's going to go down, the sound's going to go off, the lights will go down, and eventually this whole building will just collapse on us. That's how bad it is. So the other one is I wrote out what I wanted to say, and I just did this the other day. But because I have a pretty bad memory, and I feel like if I tell my story, I'm going to just miss tons of spots. But that being said, my plan was to, and I think I told you all this morning, was to record this into my phone, and on the drive up here, keep listening back on the Bluetooth, and every night when I go to bed in the motel, put the earphones on. But Thursday day, I had a terrible allergy attack. And between all the sneezing and all that fun, I just couldn't get to recording it. So I'm probably gonna try to mostly go off script. I'm just gonna look at this occasionally, but I do want to read a few things. I want to thank people. I want to thank Ginger Lockwood for inviting me to this event. She's worked so hard on this, and she is such a kind and gentle soul. And I was honored to be invited, you know. And I want to thank Tom Cantrell, who I have yet to meet, and maybe, hopefully, I will someday here. I know he's kind of the brainchild of all this, and one of the main reasons we're here today. I want to thank Arla Collette, Sam Chandler, Keith Bearden, Bob Gimlin, Bill and Amy Lancaster, Alex Midnight Walker, Michael Cook, who, you know, I was a little disappointed that he didn't wear the kilt, as he promised. Richard Stewart Taylor and Jason Weaver, I was very moved by his story today. For welcoming me and for all of us being here. I'm just, even if I didn't tell my story today, I could just see her and talk about these last couple of days, how awesome it's been to meet all you people and the stuff I'm learning from everybody here. It's just been, I'm sad that it's going to have to end today. Of course, you know, I do want to get back and see my family, but it's, you know, it's nice to get into with a group of like-minded people. I mean, I was discussing this with somebody, it might have been you, that, you know, I've come to a point where I'm comfortable with talking about it now, and I'll occasionally just bring it up in front of people I know don't want to even hear about it, just to get their reaction. But, you know, sometimes it's like, oh, there goes Philip again, talking about his Bigfoot stuff, you know, and that's kind of the thing. But I grew up in a family that, I will say, for all of its dysfunction, in the early years when my parents were together, one of the things they did was they nurtured in me that part that, you know, we're talking about, the part Jason talked about. I was in tune with a lot of kind of, I hate to use the word paranormal, but I was in tune with the spirit world at a young age. And so I was the one, and I have a twin brother. He kind of grew up much more conservative minded in that way, and he was interested in the stuff, but he was embarrassed to have that book about UFOs on the coffee table. But from an early age, I had made it clear this is my interest, you know, and so that part is kind of freeing when you can be that person that's like, hey, you know, this is who I am, this is what I talk about. But to be able to be in a group of people occasionally where everybody's like, you're finishing each other's sentences half the time. And, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. You know, instead of just all the, you know, anyway, so that's really been, that's been a wonderful thing for me. I've talked to all y'all just about at one point. I'm like, wow, I just feel like a kid in the candy store, you know? And so I want to pretty much tell a story about how my perception of Sasquatch was peppered by the life I grew up in at an early age, and how there was a galvanizing moment back in 2015 that that served to turn my perception. I'm not saying, I grew up in a really fearful situation. And I'm not saying I am a work in progress, and I still fall back into fear all the time, you know. One of my big things was fear of the dark, period. Not just Bigfoot, just fear of the dark, like crippling, paralyzing fear. So I grew up, and there are going to be times I'm not talking about Sasquatch, and you're all going to be like, is this about Sasquatch at all? But it really is. It is and it isn't. It's also about our perception of these things around us and how our lives color that and how it colors us as, you know, as well. So just a little background. I grew up in a very large family. 6 sisters, twin brother, and another brother. And at one point, believe it or not, when I was really little, we all lived together. It's a real complicated thing. Half sisters, half siblings over here, over here. The one true full-blood brother was my twin brother. But I do consider most of my half siblings, I don't go around going, this is my half sister Becky. You know, they're my siblings, you know. My mother and father were professional jazz musicians, and they stayed on the road a lot of the time when I was little. And I'm the baby, even I was 4 minutes younger than my twin. So a lot of times it was my older sisters taking care of us on the weekend and stuff. But it was a very chaotic and dark house to live in. My father was a raging alcoholic. 1.5 quarts of vodka a day, Valium, Speed, 3 packs of Winston's, and all this was just his way of doing what he had to do. Or he thought so anyway. And then my mom, who'd grown up in something really dark when she grew up as a kid, she had to grow to be a really strong woman, overly strong, overly powerful. She had to always deal with these incompetent men who were telling her she was stupid all the time, you know. And like Jason, if I get emotional, you know, that's going to happen sometimes. But so I was always in touch. I was, you know, ghosts and all this kind of stuff were really like a literal part of my life. I made my sister Becky sit in the chair next to me in the bed at night with the light on until I fell asleep. At one point, I was just so overcome with ghosts and the fear of ghosts that I actually literally pulled a trick on myself, and it worked. I transformed my fear of ghosts consciously into a fear of burglars. But it worked too well, and then I was panicked about this man coming up a ladder and getting in the window, you know. Now, I did have a few fun things. Like I would see in my bed at night this literally physically, like visually see a stagecoach that would go by and just pass by. And it was translucent. It was full color, but translucent, with just the horses and this guy with a whip just going by. And that was kind of a peaceful thing for me. I don't know what in the world it was, why it was, but it was, maybe it was one thing that kind of provided a little bit of relief from. But, you know, I had nightmares every night. Like, I still have nightmares. I was talking about it with somebody last night. I suffer sleep paralysis. That makes a regular nightmare look like a joyride, you know, when you're locked down on your bed and you feel like something's pressing on you. And so I grew up with a lot of that kind of stuff. And but still, I had a deep interest in all this spooky stuff. And my mom and father, when they were still together, they bought me books on the paranormal. My father had books on Bigfoot and UFOs on the shelf, and I was always getting in that shelf and just reading and looking at this stuff. And that was really, so I guess my introduction into Bigfoot was that book he had, which dealt mostly with the Sierra Nevada stuff from the early 70s. But we went to see a movie when I was maybe 7 years old. It was, I believe it was called The Great Waldo Pepper, and it was a Robert Redford movie. And back then, you weren't bombarded with 30 minutes of trailers for other movies all the time. You would get short films as introductions. I remember watching Mr. Magoo. You know, you get cartoons and stuff like that. And it was a short film about Bigfoot, a little 15, 20-minute documentary. And of course, it had the Patterson-Gimlin film. And I know people probably like in the Bigfoot community, like, if I hear Patterson-Gimlin one more time. But truthfully, it is such a galvanizing piece of footage, you know, and for so many reasons. And so I'm a 7-year-old looking at that and hearing, I don't remember what the recordings were. They may have been, I don't think it was the Sierra things. I don't know if they'd been released that, because this was 73 maybe, and that was still going on. But I heard some kind of recordings of screams and howls, and it just filled me with this. On the one hand, I was terrified, but I was so intrigued. And I remember thinking, because this documentary, like everything kind of did back then, it painted it all as kind of Pacific Northwest. I remember that. But I remember thinking while we're watching, I'm like, wait a minute, Georgia's got mountains somewhere. And I kept thinking, I wonder if they're in the Georgia mountains. And of course, little did I know just where they are, you know, not just the mountains, you know. So that was my introduction into that, and I got pretty obsessed with it for a while, as well as all the other things I was into, ghosts and UFOs. But life moves on, and I became a teenager, and I got interested in girls, and because of that dark life that I'd grown up in, you know, I got interested, just like Jason said, in alcohol and drugs. I thought it was partying. Later I realized a lot of this was self-medicinal stuff going on. But I really went, you know, full tilt into that kind of thing. But, you know, also just all hanging out with your buddies and all that. And we'd go camping a lot. So it, you know, kind of left my mind for those kind of things. You know, the whole thing with like alcohol with people, like my mother-in-law, she's like, her father was an alcoholic, and her reaction to me, it was, I never want to be like that. And I remember seeing my father hammered and going, I want to know what it's like to be like that. You know, I was just curious. They would come home. You know, I remember one night I was having this nightmare. I was sleeping on a cot, and I had this nightmare that a wolf man was trying to bang his way into the front door. And then I wake up, and it's mom and dad coming to the front door screaming at each other. They just got back from being on the road. And they would come up, you know, my twin brother, we had trundle beds. So I slept, of course, I got the shitty part, and he got the good one, you know. And they'd come in the room, and it's like, I'll get off mic for a minute here. Mom is, you know, dad's like, you know, he's just staggering. He's like, you, and I won't use all the expletives, but everything you can think of. He's just looking at her and pointing his finger, and then she's going, Kim, Philip, I want you to see this. This is your father, you know. Now I kind of look back at that part and laugh, because she's like, you know, but that kind of thing really, you just, you know, you don't, and I don't blame them. They were doing the best they could with the tools they had. They had a pretty limited toolkit. But you know, when you go to a 5-year-old kid who's sleeping at 3 in the morning and ask them to pick who they think is right, you know, is dad right or am I right? And so, but anyway, getting back, so up into my mid-20s, this was around 95, I went camping in Okefenokee Swamp. I don't know how many of you have ever been down there, but it's South Georgia. And it's as wild as the North Georgia mountains are. I mean, it's, you're not seeing, you know, billboards or any of that. There's no, once you get in there, it's 450,000 acres of just pure wilderness. And to me, it's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. It's so primordial. And I had made this concerted effort with a bunch of them. I was living in Athens, Georgia at the time. I was like, I want to do the male bonding thing. Let's get a bunch of guys and go down to the swamp every summer and bring our fishing rods. We know we won't catch a thing. Bring a bunch of beer, you know. But get out there and get in the water, and it started happening. And so this one year in 95, we were down there, and I was with my friend Bob in a canoe on a tributary off one of the bigger lakes in there called Billy's Lake. And we're just paddling, and all of a sudden I hear this something rustling around in the thicket, in the water, right at the water's edge. And my first thought was a deer. But then it just sounded so huge, and it was moving through this stuff, and I still couldn't really see much. But I could see something kind of dark in there, and so my next thought was hog or a bear. But then basically what happened right after that, and we're probably 40 feet off, we're 40 feet away or so in the tributary. And I just saw this thing get up and turn away from us and move its way back into the thicket and back onto more solid ground. It didn't run, it didn't do the whole plowing thing. I could hear the branches and stuff moving, but after a while, it has suddenly really got strangely silent quickly as it just seemed to fade off. It was just a few moments, but of course I got a good look at its backside. I don't know how many of you have ever seen a photograph that's reputedly a trail cam picture by Melissa Hovey took credit for it. It's supposed to be somewhere up here in Georgia. I know that's supposed to be a hoax. It probably, obviously could be. These days you can do amazing things with technology. But if it is a hoax, it's an incredible one. You can see like bumps on the skin and you can see what looks like ticks. This is what this thing looked like to me. It wasn't completely hair covered. You could see right through the hair, which might have been about that long, but really sparse. Unbelievable musculature. The shoulders, and I'm guessing between 6 and 6.5 feet. It wasn't patty, it wasn't 7, 8 feet, but still just impressive and clearly not a bear. Their shoulders, that's the thing. There's shoulders on this. Bears do occasionally get on their 2 legs, but they don't have shoulders. At least not that, We were in shock. This wasn't a frightful experience for me. It was utter shock because I wasn't even prepared for it. I'd kind of gotten away from all that many years. I was like 28 years old or something at the time. And there was that moment of shock, and then it disappeared, and we didn't have anything else to do but keep trying to paddle back to our camp, which was probably another mile away. And so we started doing just full of expletives the whole time, the WTF is what everybody does now. And we're comparing notes. What did you see? What did I see? But we agreed when we got back to camp, we weren't talking about this. We were buddies with a pretty hardcore group of people who would call you out on whatever, any sign of weakness or anything, it was ribbing. It was usually good natured. I don't mean it to be like really harsh people, but I wasn't prepared for that. He wasn't. We didn't ride back. We'd always caravan to these trips. It was like 10 guys. It was like several cars. He and I didn't ride back together to Athens, so we never even spoke about it again. And it really does. It's just so hard to explain what comes over you when anything like that happens to you. And I know this is probably using a really terrible negative analogy, but if anybody's ever been on the highway and seen a really terrible wreck, how it just, your moment, everything changes, everything becomes surreal. You're like, this can't be really, I'm not really witnessing this. I certainly don't mean to paint Bigfoot in the same picture with a bad wreck, but just that anything that's so out of your ordinary experience. Even though I had a deep willingness to want to believe in it back then, once this happened, the belief part gets taken away, or the disbelief part gets taken away. I don't know what this thing we're experiencing is called reality. It may not be real, but it was as real as I am, or as real as you and I are in my experience. But then, lots of time went by again, and I didn't have anybody to talk about it with. I did share it with my girlfriend, who's now my wife. But so you don't get it out like you guys have been talking about here. Some of it's just being able to purge things, So put it back down, and a lot more time went by. That was 95. So within 15 years of that, it's almost like a distant dream, and you can tell yourself, did I really see that? You can do that even with something as powerful as that, And so fast forward, I guess I'm on the internet somewhere in 2012, and Bigfoot's pretty much all over the internet at that point, and I got interested in it again. And I had a chance to go on a camping trip, not a camping trip, sorry. I do these things, usually there's people involved that don't want to do tents, so we're like, well, I want to find the cabin that's closest to nothing, So we had an opportunity to go into a cabin northeast of Helen, Georgia in 2013. It was myself and my wife and another couple, really close friends of ours. The thing with Bigfoot was like with the Larry, the husband, don't go there. So he didn't even know. My goal for going up here is strictly to get out there and start figuring what this is about. If I can find anything for myself. This was in 2013. It was right at the beginning of spring. I think literally when we went up there, I think it was April 1st. And I did. I started going out. We went along this river called the Soquie River up. This is like northeast of Helen. And the area above the area we're staying is just pure wilderness, no more cabins, no more cul-de-sacs and all that stuff. And I started walking. I went about a mile to a mile and a half in. I knew if I followed the river, I was between a river and a mountain. I knew I couldn't get lost. No matter how, as long as we went in between the river and the mountain, we just had to follow that back because I didn't bring a compass. I found my first foot track. I'm not going to bore y'all with all the details of that. Most of y'all know about this stuff way more than I do, but I do know that I did enough to determine that if this was a human being, at the time I weighed 215, 210 pounds, this thing would have had to have been triple my weight or at least to put the impression it did into the sandbank it was on is always wet because of the splashing river. And a lot of people say wet will make it soft. This is packed down, hard packed. There was a bear track in the same, like just a few feet away. Clearly a bear track. I don't know how people confuse bear tracks with Bigfoot tracks. I know occasionally they do the doubled over thing, but there's still a major difference in my estimation of it. So I was so excited about that. That just like, once I saw that, it brought back the memory of my sighting. Plus there was this intense feeling the whole time of being watched. I really had that feeling that we were being observed. I did find a very interesting hare that was nearby the track. And later when I got back home, all the pictures I took, I saw a few interesting things in the laurel leaves. Now, I leave that open that these things could be, as they call pareidolia. That is a very real thing, and some of us start falling prey to that. You know what I'm talking about. You're online, somebody's posted a picture of leaves, and it's got 15, 20 black circles everywhere. I'm not saying it might not be stuff, but, I've always seen faces and everything, in the woodwork on a door, you can see faces, and especially when you want to see them. So I left that part open. But I did see enough that I was really intrigued. Still, there was some fear on that trip. But what happened was the next year, I went back up into the mountains with my wife and my dog. 2014, we went to Fort Mountain. Once again, Stacy didn't want anything to do with the tent. We got a cabin. This is on Highway 52 in between Ellijay and Cohutta, like dead center. And we got there kind of late in the afternoon, so we got unpacked. I started making dinner. We just kind of settled in that night. I stayed out on the porch, which the back of the cabin went down into a ravine, and I just sat on the porch overlooking the ravine. Of course, I couldn't see. It was night. I stayed up, and nothing happened except for one lone, at about 2 in the morning, one lone tree knot. And that was enough for me right there. It was big, but it wasn't hard. It was a really soft kind of, but it sounded like it was maybe a half a mile away. It was very reverberated, and it was lonely sounding. It was just this one knock. I stayed for a while longer. I didn't hear anything else. I went to bed. The next morning, I got up really early. Like normally I sleep in, if I can. I'm up, with the sun coming up to get Douglas out. And I was not going to stir Stacy, let her sleep in. We're just going to go walk up this dirt road just so I can see what I can see. And this is my first experience with the woo. So we go up about a half a mile up this trail and going really back towards the highway on the road that got us down here. And something in my head, once again, like other people describe, it's always your own voice. I wasn't hearing, just said, look down. And I looked down in the middle of the road, and there's a triangle made out of a stick in the middle of the road. Don't have pictures. I do have pictures of it actually, but I'm not doing any of that. You know what I mean. The triangle was made out of one stick. It wasn't 3 sticks. One corner was broken just enough to make it bend, but it was still attached. The other corner was made, and of course for a second I played with this. I'm like, could this just happen? But when I coupled it with the fact that something told me to look down and the unlikelihood of this thing, I just became flooded with this knowing this was here to tell me, we know you're here, and we know we're looking for you. Now, here's the thing about that. I was all excited. I made a second one just like it, put it by it, took a picture of it. It's like, here, I'm giving you one too. I didn't realize that this, in my belief now, was an invitation into something much bigger than just hide and seek. But I didn't take that invitation. That was the height of the experience in terms of excitement in a good way. Everything else then, from the point of that trip on, got darker and darker and darker. And I had put out that first night we got there, I'd put out some gifts down that ravine in the form of food. I didn't hear anything happen that night when I sat out on the porch. Well, the next night I stayed out again. This is already getting kind of old with my wife, you know. She's there to relax and have a good time. It wasn't like we couldn't do some Bigfooting, but, you know, she's got other things on her mind and won't go any further with that. And I'm staying out on the porch all night, you know, because I'm just becoming obsessed. And, you know, I think there's somebody here, I believe it was Arla, before I had met her, warned about getting into this subject so deep and going down this rabbit hole so deep that you start letting go of the other things in your life. And, you know, your wife, your child, I didn't have a child yet, but your job, shit, your fucking hygiene, excuse me. And I know what she means, and I really started thinking maybe I've got to develop a problem. I can't drive down a highway without staring into the forest looking for stick structures. I'm like, I'm a danger on the road. But I stayed up on the porch that night, and I don't know how to describe this. I'm going to do the best I can. Something or multiple somethings were moving from the creek at the bottom up the ravine towards the porch. And it's, once again, this experience it was not visual at all. It was only auditory. And that's a point I want to touch on too. As a species, we think in terms of sight. We're so reliant on eyesight. That's why people are, have you ever seen one? It's just vibration. Everything's vibration. But we always, we even use the words I see to mean I understand. But there's so much more to things than just eyesight that are validated, you know, because it's all vibration. Whatever was coming up this ravine was doing it in like almost comically but scary, rapid, and it would stop. And it was several of them. I could hear that. And it was not bipedal. It was moving. It sounded to me like on four legs. But I mean, that ravine was, you know, like this. And I just became flooded with fear. I was just certain that whatever these things were coming up, and they were literally going to come up underneath the cabin, underneath that porch, and I couldn't handle it. It was terrifying to me. All the nightmare stuff, you know, and I got off that porch and I went into the bedroom and I started asking myself, what are you even doing here? What are you trying to invoke? And I was wishing there were blinds on the window in the bedroom, which there weren't, and I went to bed. And the trip just continued like that. The next night we're toasting marshmallows outside on a fire with our dog Douglas there. They go inside, and I just had this powerful feeling of being watched, and I became gripped with so much fear I couldn't move. I couldn't go inside. And I don't even know that I was being watched at that point. I just think my fears had overtaken me. Like all the nightmares from childhood, all that stuff played into this. It all came back, and this was the boogeyman, and yes, I'm going to get taken, or my wife's going to get taken. The next day, we went up to Lake Conasuega, or however you pronounce that, Conasuga, which is still in the same area, the Cohutter Wilderness. I found my first tree structure. I was like, you know, I filmed that. But I was so obsessed with keeping Stacy and my dog within sight. I was so afraid they were going to round a corner and something was going to snatch them. And I know I had to sound like just a complete jerk control freak the whole time. You guys wait, you know. That's how bad this fear was really starting to grip me. So that was 2014, late summer. Through some odd little connections, I had an opportunity in November of 2014. I went to a wedding in Brevard, North Carolina. Beautiful town. If y'all have never been there, it's one of those places you go and you think, I could live here. You know, I could do this. But in a conversation after the wedding with somebody overheard me mentioning that I paint houses, and they're, oh, you're a painter? And next thing you know, I had an opportunity to move to St. Augustine and work on Flagler College, refurbishing the whole college for incredible money, more money than I'd ever seen at that point in my life. And I was like, I can't not do this. It's working with a group of what are called conservators. They're basically highfalutin contractors. They're sipping espresso and painting, redoing murals and terracotta. But the main part of this job was taking the windows back to the wood and redoing them exactly the way they were done in the 1800s, minus the lead paint, of course. So it was an awesome experience. I went down there, I would work 4 to 5 week stretches. The bad part is I had to leave my wife, they set me up with a house there and all that stuff. But it was, I was working 6 days a week, 9 to 10 hours a day, and I had Sunday off. But these were good people to work with. It was good work. But the whole thing really did get off to a really weird start. They couldn't find a place for me at first, so they stuck me in a motel, which wasn't really that bad because it was on the beach on Anastasia Island, so that wasn't too bad. But I was really getting tired of the motel thing. They found a house for me. Within 2 weeks, I was eaten up by bed bugs, so it was back to the motels. And finally, they get a place for me. Am I doing okay on time? Because I'm getting to the meat of this. Okay. Just checking, time disappears when you're rambling. So I'm finally thinking things are starting to settle in. I did cut my head bad on the scaffolding. I was going up these ladders and thought there was an entranceway, and it was a boom! So it's like, how many other things are going to go wrong down here? But after I got the place they set me up in right downtown with some of the other workers, everything seemed to be smoothing out. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned, because I'm kind of just doing this off the cuff, is all that darkness that I experienced as a kid, it also really affected my twin brother. But at least I had the freedom to express myself in something like we've talked about. My twin brother grew up to stuff all that stuff down, way down, and lived the whole picket fence life, 2.5 kids and the dog and all that, and he had a great job as a manager for a company. Everybody loved him. The thing is, all this was BS. He was such. One of the things, in addition to family life, that messed him up big time was when we were going to school. He was left-handed. As soon as we got in first grade, you can't be left-handed. You have to write with your right hand. They forced him to write with his right hand. It induced dyslexia immediately. Next thing you know, he's in the special schools and the special classes and all that comes along with it. We would get in fights as kids, and usually he'd be beating my butt. But I had this trump card, which I feel terrible about now. But if I was getting my head smashed in too bad, I would just go, "You're stupid," and he would just let go of me and just stop and cry. I really regret that. But he stuffed all this stuff down. He built this life for himself. But then it started to erode. He got into addiction, and that started bringing things down. Eventually his marriage crumbled. And, I called him when I got this job. He's an incredible, he'd never done anything with wood before in his life. And then he set out to do tongue and groove counters in his kitchen, and he did it like that. And I was like, "Ken, get out of this mess you're in. Come down here with me. They'll take you on. You'll make good money. You'll be able to get away from your demons." I kept calling him to do that. They needed more people. He would not leave Savannah. He was determined he was going to get his wife back. I knew that wasn't going to happen. And so what happened was he died in April. And I had to go back up. I had just gotten back down off vacation up there seeing my wife. And I got back down there, and it's the day I got back down there, I got a call from my sister Rosie. He's in the hospital. There's been some kind of bad accident. Now, this situation, I'm not going to go into all the details because it's really complex, and it would take away from the story overall that I'm trying to weave, but it was his demons that took him down, even though it was sort of an accident. It was a really complex thing, but I go up there. He's had a double hematoma. He's in and out of consciousness. They can't tell us at this point if he's going to come out or if he's going to be brain damaged. But the hospital made a huge mistake, and the names got mixed up. It was a similar name to his, and I don't know why there wasn't a number system or something else, but he got administered blood thinners, and he went into his brain basically got pushed down into the brain stem, and at that point he was on a machine, and we had to make the decision at some point to pull the plug, and we did. It was the hardest decision in the world, and I've gone all my life not having to see funerals, or if they were cremations, closed casket. I'd never witnessed the bad wreck. I used an example earlier. I've never witnessed a bad wreck on a highway. I've seen wrecks, but no gore, And I knew I had to be in there for my brother when we had to do that moment, and I had to sit there and watch him die. And that's still the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But anyway, I'm not trying to bring y'all down. I'm just painting the story of what happened. So I did the funeral and all that stuff that we do, when somebody's left their mortal coil. 5? Okay, great. So I got back down to St. Augustine. I was ready to get back into work, get myself off of this, and Sundays were the only day I had off. I spent every Sunday when I was down there out squatching. I had 3 main areas I would go into. I thought about just staying home that first Sunday back down there, but I was like, the last thing I need to do is sit around and think. So I went to this area called the Bayard Conservation Area. It was one of the main places I would go. And weirdly, this is a place where I always felt watched, but I didn't ever feel any fear in this place. And so I got there was nobody there as usual. Always had the whole place to myself. Sat on the St. Johns River. I'm walking down this path. It's really more of like a dirt road that's used by the state vehicles, I think, maintenance road, headed towards the river. Everything's great. I'm in the moment. I'm taking in the smells of pine. The wind's kind of gently caressing the pine trees northward. I'm just kind of being in the moment with all this stuff and that feeling of being watched. And I did this for a moment, and all of a sudden, all that changed in an instant, and everything about my brother came flooding back, and I just started crying like I'd never cried before, and just bawling, and I just became nothing. I was still walking, but I was just like walking and crying and walking and crying, and everything disappeared. The forest I was in disappeared. The world disappeared. It just became a ball of grief for a while, and slowly, as I moved on, I wouldn't even know where I was walking, but somehow I stayed on that path. And then I heard some movement in the thicket. I was kind of coming a little bit out of the deeper part of the grief. I was still a sad sack. And I was about 40 feet off the road. This was pretty clear, a wide area here, the road and then grass and then thicket and pine trees. And I looked, I didn't see anything, but I kept hearing something jiggling around in there. And I just kept walking, and eventually I got to the river, and I stayed there for about 20 minutes, just sitting with my thoughts, watching the boats go by, and I was like, I'm going to go home. There's not any squatching today. So I start walking back. There's a pretty good distance on this walk. I'm not giving you all those details. In the middle of the road was a freshly plucked flower, and it had a green stem, and it was kind of daisy-like, but it wasn't a daisy. It had white petals and a yellow center. I looked down. There are no flowers growing anywhere inside the road or outside the road or even in my view off to the woods. And I knew this thing was freshly plucked because at the broken part, some weeds you'll break, you see that white milky stuff come out? It was just oozing out. And this thing was plump. It was not wilted, and it was Florida heat already. And I know what that'll do to a plant that's been picked real quick. I did my best to rationalize it. There was no stem growing out of the ground anywhere nearby. There were no other people there. And once again, like with that triangle, I knew I was being observed, and somebody was sharing in my grief and sending condolences to me. And by the time I got to the car with the flower, it had already wilted. And so to wrap this up, that moment had so much an effect on me of moving from thinking these things are just these big, monstrous, whether they're woo or not. I entertained the idea that they were woo, but I still was entertaining that it was bad woo, bad juju. All that changed in that moment. Now, as I said, now I still fall back into fear sometimes, but when we were on that walk last night, somebody was ahead of me and they were in the fear. And she said, I don't want to be in the front anymore. And I said, come walk by me, you know, because I felt comfortable. I felt, you know, Sam is, you know, it was just, I didn't care that it was raining. Like, this guy knows what's going on. That guy knows what's going on. Like, you know, and it was a wonderful experience. And I told her, I said, I know what you're going through. I've been there. And so I know, just walk with me and we'll be okay. And so for me, that was the transformation. And I'm still moving through it. But that's what I wanted to share with y'all. And once again, I appreciate every one of y'all. And I really love being here with y'all. And I look forward to the rest of this day. Thank you.